Let's build a contact list component using Django and Django-Unicorn. So what we're going to do in this video is on the left hand side of the page we're going to display a form that allows users to add another user to their contact list, and on the right hand side we're going to display all of the contacts that a user has in their list. So let's get started. We have here a GitHub repository that contains the starter code, and this is important that we clone from this because in the requirements.txt file it contains some important packages for getting started. We have, for example, Django OAuth, which is going to let users authenticate and log into the application, and this is important because we are going to be building a user list and users need to be logged in with a username in order to actually create contacts in this application. We also have Django-Unicorn in the requirements file, and we also have Faker, which is going to allow us to generate some realistic fake data. So let's go to VS Code. I've cloned this particular repository and here's the requirements file. What we're going to do to get started is we're going to define in the models.py file a custom user model for this application. So let's call this user, and it's going to inherit from the Django abstract user. And it's actually recommended when you start a Django project, you should not use the default user model. There are different ways to extend that in Django. One such way, and the one that I use the most, is just to subclass the abstract user like this, and then you can add any other fields that you want to that default user model. For example, we're going to add a contacts field, and that's going to be equal to a models.many-to-many field. And a many-to-many field here is going to let a user have many different other users as part of their contact list, and it's not going to limit that to a one-to-many or many-to-one relationship. Now the field that we're actually creating the relation with is also the user model, so we can use the self argument here to create the relation between the user model and other users, and that's called a self-referential field in Django. So basically we create a user model that extends the abstract user, and then we're creating a contacts list where a user can have many contacts, which are other users in the database. Once we've done that, we need to go to Django's settings file and tell Django that we want to use this as our default user model, and we can do that using a setting called authUserModel, and we can set that equal to the core.userModel. That's in the core application that we have here. Within the models file, we have this user model, so we're referencing that here and setting the auth user model to that model. Now I'm also going to set one more setting here, and that's the login redirect URL. We want to redirect to the index view or the index URL, which you can find here in the urls.py file, and that loads up this index view that you can see within the views.py file, and that renders a template called index.html. That's the setup of our application at the moment. Once we've done that, we can go down to the terminal and we're going to run python manage.py make migrations. That will create the user model, and then after that we can run the migrate command to actually create the SQLite database locally. And once we've created that database, we're going to go to this management folder that was in the starter code, and we have a file here called createusers.py, and this is a management command that allows us to create some fake users in the database so that we can get up and running with this application. And it uses Faker to generate a fake username and also a fake email address. So we can run that by running the python manage.py create users command. That's going to run through this for loop here and create a user for each of these iterations. So that's the setup of our application complete. What we're going to do now is go to Django-Unicorn's documentation here, and there's this section here which I'll link below the video, and it's about integrating Unicorn with Django. There are some steps we need to run through here. First of all, we need to add Django-Unicorn to our installed apps. So let's go to settings.py and we'll scroll up to the installed apps list here, and we're going to add Django-Unicorn just below here. We can paste that in and go back to the documentation. The second thing we need to do is amend the projects urls.py and add the Django-Unicorn URLs to that. So let's copy that statement and go back to urls.py here within the project, and we can paste that just below the Django OAuth URLs that we're including here. We're now going to include the Django-Unicorn URLs as well. Once we've done that, again, let's go back to the documentation, and we're going to load the Unicorn template tags by copying this statement here, and we're going to go to our Django index.html template here that contains some startup code, and we're going to paste this load statement at the top, and that's going to let us use the Unicorn template tag a little bit later in the video. Let's now go back to the documentation. We also have to add Unicorn scripts into the Django template, so let's copy this, and as you can see below, it belongs in the head tag of the HTML. So what we're going to do is go back to the index.html file. We have a block here for any extra elements we want to include within the head tag, so we're going to paste the Unicorn scripts into that, and this is extending a base template, by the way, which we have defined defined in the starter code, and that's where these blocks are coming from. So we have a block called extra head. It lives within the head tag of the HTML document, and then within the index.html we are overriding that block, and we're adding the Django-Unicorn scripts to that head tag. And the final thing we need to do, if we go back to the documentation, we also need to add the CSRF token into the body of the document. So let's go back to the template here, and I'm just going to paste that into this div tag at the top. It's just going to reference the CSRF token, and that allows Django-Unicorn to securely send post requests to the back end. So hopefully that's our setup complete. What we're now going to do is go back to the Unicorn documentation, and there's a page here on components that I'm going to reference, and Django-Unicorn uses the term component to refer to a set of interactive functionality that can be put into your templates. And Unicorn ships with a management command that allows you to actually create these components or skeleton these components from scratch, and it's the start Unicorn command. The first argument after that is the name of the app that you want the Unicorn component to live in, and then after that you can define any number of Unicorn components separated by spaces. So what we're going to do is copy this command, python manage.py start unicorn. We're going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that in here, and the app that we're going to use is the core application. So let's type core in, and the name of the component that we're going to create is called contact page. So let's execute that script, and if you want you can star the GitHub repository. I'm just going to select no to that. Once that's completed, you can see within the directories here on the left hand side, the core directory now has a directory called components that contains a Python file called contactpage.py. And if we load that up, you can see that we have a class here that inherits from Django-Unicorn's Unicorn view. One other thing that's been created by that management command, if we go to the templates directory, before we just had these two HTML files, we now have a Unicorn subdirectory that contains a contactpage.html, and that is the Django-Unicorn components template. And it's in here that we're going to add the code that actually renders out what's on the page for that given component. So let's move on, and we're going to go to our new component class here. It's called contact page view, and we're going to remove the pass statement. And we're going to create two fields within this class. The first one's called contacts, and that's going to be equal to user.objects.none, basically an empty query set by default. And actually we need to import the user from our core.models. So at the top here, from core.models, let's import this user model that we just created. So within the class, we're creating a list of contacts for the given user who is logged into the application. And just below that, we're also going to get a reference to all of the users in the database. And again, I'm going to set that equal to user.objects.none by default. And what we're going to do now is we're going to initialize this Django-Unicorn component. If I go back to the Unicorn documentation, and within this components page on the right hand side we have a sidebar that contains component arguments as one of the options. If we click that, we're going to copy the boilerplate code here for overriding the initialization method init. And this is the method that's called when the component is first loaded in your application. So we can copy that, and what we're going to do is we're going to paste that into our component, and we can remove the code at the bottom here. We don't need that line of code, but this line of code here calling the superclasses init method, that is actually required when you're overriding this. Now the reason we're overriding init is because we want to set the contacts and the users fields within this class, and we need to do that dynamically by referencing the requests user, whoever is logged into the application. So what I'm going to do here is refer to self.contacts. We're going to find all of the contacts for the logged in user. Now we can get the logged in user in this class by referencing self.request, and the request object in Django has a property called user which references whoever is actually sending the request, and if it's a logged in user it will have the details about that user. If not, it will be an anonymous user. So that gives us the user who is actually accessing this page, and we're going to assume that they're logged in, and we're going to get the contacts for that user, and we're going to get all of those contacts. So we have the user object and we're getting all of the contacts. This comes from the many to many field. If we go back to our models.py file, we have a user who has many contacts, and that is actually a different related manager in Django. So contacts refers to a manager, and you can call .all on that in order to get all of those contacts. So that covers the user's contacts. What we now need to do is actually set this users property, and we're going to see why we need this in a second. Basically, we're going to get all of the users in the database except from the user who's actually sending the request and is logged in. And that's so that we can show all of the other users in a drop down. So in order to do that, let's call the user.objects.exclude method. And we want to exclude the user who's logged in. So we're going to remove the user with the primary key that matches the self.request.user.primary key. So this gets the ID of the logged in user, and we are then matching that with the primary key from the database and excluding that particular user. So this is going to set the contacts and the users fields within this unicorn component to these two query sets that are returned from these statements. Now we're going to actually reference this unicorn template within the parent template. So we had here an index.html file. What I'm going to do is run the Django development server with python manage.py run server, and we're going to go to the page. And this is how this page looks at the moment. We have a link here to a login page, and this is coming straight from Django-Olof. What I'm going to do is create a user whose password I know, and I'm going to do that by stopping the server. I'm going to run the create super user command. Let's give this user a username of admin, and we can give them a dummy password. And then we can run the server again, and we're going to try and log in as this user called admin. So we set the username as admin, and we put in our password. And we're taken to the same page, except that the link has now changed to log out. So that's how our application looks. Let's go back to the index.html file. And if we go to the bottom of this page, we have an HR element here. Underneath that, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Django-Unicorn template tag here. And we're going to load up our component called contact page. And that is then going to load up the template associated with this component, which is this one here. And it's going to load that into whatever we specify in this particular parent template. Now you'll notice in our component class, which we have here, we're referencing the self.request.user. That must be a logged in user. So we're going to go back to this template, and we're going to surround this declaration here with an if statement. And we're going to check if the user who's sending this request is authenticated. So if they are authenticated, we're going to load up the unicorn component. Otherwise, we are not going to do that. So now that we have that, let's go to our contact page template here. And we're going to change the template that's loaded by this Django-Unicorn component. Now what we want to display on the left hand side of this template is a select box containing all of the users from this field of the Unicorn component. So we need a drop down, a select box, and we're going to show that on the left hand side. Now in order to add some styles to this select box, we're going to use Tailwind CSS. 𝗏𝗏𝗽 contains some starter code for implementing some of these different form fields. For example, on the right hand side here, we have an option for the select input. So if we click that, we're taken down to this select input here, and you get some code here, and you can copy the classes associated with that code into the template. Now if you're unfamiliar with select elements in HTML, they are defined using the select tag, and that tag has some child elements called option elements, and each option is represented in the drop down as something that the user can select, and then that will set the value of that select element to the options value. So what we're going to do is paste some code into our component template. So I'm going to remove this and paste in some code, and I'm going to quickly explain what this code is doing. So we have a div here that contains a class of grid and grid columns 2. So we're going to separate the page into 2 columns, and the left hand side is going to contain a form with this select box that's going to allow the user to add contacts to their contact list, and that's the code that we've got here. Later on in the right hand side, we're going to display a list of contacts, but let's focus on this for now. We have a header saying add a contact, and then we define a form element here that contains a select field. Now the classes on the select field are copied directly from 𝗏𝗏𝗽, and then the children of that element, we have the option class with the empty value, and then we're looping over the users that are defined in our unicorn component, and that's this field here that we set during the init method to every user in the database except the user that's sending the request. So within the template, we're looping over each one of those users, and we're creating an option for each user. The value is set to the user's ID, the primary key, and the value that you see on the front end is set to the user's username. Finally, below the select box, we have a button here, and that button allows us to actually add the user to the contact list. Now this isn't going to work yet, we've not wired it up to work, but let's see how it looks on the page. If we go back to our page here and refresh this page, You can see we now have this form and we have a drop down containing a list of users that have been added via that management command that we defined earlier. So with this setup, we can now use Django-Unicorn in order to actually control the elements in the page and add users to the contact list when, for example, we select a user and then hit this button. The first thing that we want to do is we want to bind the value of whatever's been selected in this select box to a variable on the component. So let's go back to VS Code here, and I'm going to go to our component class, and we're going to define a new field on the class. It's called contact primary key, and we're going to set that to none by default when the component first loads. And then we want to bind what's been selected in the select box to this field in our component. So we can do that by going back to the component template. And to the select option here, we're going to add a unicorn directive. So it's going to be unicorn and then a colon, and the directive is the model directive, and we set this equal to one of the fields that we have in our unicorn component class, and the field that we just defined there was called contact primary key. So this code has the effect of whenever the select box changes, it's going to update the value within our Django-Unicorn component so that the contact primary key is reflected in that particular field. And the other thing we need to do, of course, is when we hit the add user button here, we want to actually send a request to the backend when this form is submitted in order to actually add this user that's been selected to the logged in user's contact list. So what we're going to do is go back to the template again, and it's the contact page template. When we submit the button, we click this button here. It's got a type of submit, as you can see. That's going to submit the form. So what we're going to do is we're going to target this form element here, and we're going to use a Django-Unicorn action, which is basically an event that occurs. So we use the unicorn and then the colon syntax, and the event name is the submit event. And this is an event that occurs on a form element in HTML. And we're going to add a modifier here, and that's called prevent, and that's going to prevent the default action when you submit a form of sending a request to the server. What we're going to do instead is we're going to set the value of this attribute equal to a function that we're going to define, or a method that we're going to define on the Django-Unicorn component class, and it's going to be called add contact. So let's copy the name of this, and we're going to go back to contact page, and we're going to write a Python function now, a method within this class called add contact, and that will take self as an argument as it's a class method. And what we can do to start with is we can actually just print out self.contact primary key here to see what the value is that's been submitted from the form to our unicorn component. So let's save that and go back to the page. We're going to refresh this page. If we select a contact from this list, for example this user here, and try and add that user, if we go back to our page, you can see we get a value of 5 printed out. That's the primary key of that user object in the database, representing the user that has been selected. And if we change that user to somebody else, Joshua Beard, which is quite a good name. If we select add user to that, if we go back to VS Code, you can see that user's primary key of 1 is printed out. So we're able to reference whatever user has been selected. We've got access to their primary key in the component. So let's write an if statement here. We're going to check if self.contact primary key, if it's a truthy value, we're going to execute the code in this if statement. Now we've already seen that the many-to-many field has a function called all. It also has a function called add, and that allows you to add a reference to another model to that relationship. So what I'm going to do is copy the code for this all statement, and I'm going to remove the function called all, and we're going to replace it with the add function. So we're taking the user that's logged in, we're referencing their contact list, and we're going to add a new contact to that list, and that contact is going to be the primary key of whatever user has been selected in the list. And after we add that user, what we're going to do is we're going to update the contacts field within the component class. So we're going to say self.contacts is equal to the same statement that we copied here. We're looking at the user, we're looking at all of their contacts, so we're going to reset self.contacts to all of these contacts after we've added the new contact. So hopefully that will work. We can also remove this print statement here. Before we test it, we need some way of seeing all of the contacts for the given user that's logged in. So what we're going to do on our page here, on the right hand side of this page, which is currently empty, we're going to add a list of existing contacts. And of course we want that list to update whenever we add a new contact. We're going to see how to do that later on. For now, let's define a list of the existing contacts within our component template, which is contact page.html. HTML. So this is the right hand side of our grid, the second column of the 2-grid system. We have a comment here for the left hand side, and underneath that div we're going to define the code for the right hand side, which is the list of existing contacts. Now I'm going to paste in some code here. Again, we'll go over this now. We're defining a div with a class of flex and flex column, which means that the items will go from top to bottom in that flex box. The first item is a header1 tag that contains the title contact list, and below that we have a UL tag, and for each contact that exists in the user's contacts, we are rendering that out with an li tag, and don't forget to close that li tag off, and we're referencing the contact's username. So let's save this file, and we're going to go back to our page here. When we refresh the page, you can see on the right hand side we have a contact list. Currently there are no contacts in this list. Let's now try and add a user to that contact list, and you can see that when we do that, the user actually appears on the right hand side. Now the question is, why is this happening? So if we go back to our components class, when we submit the form with a contact selected, this function is called. We add that contact to the user's contact list, and then we refresh the self.contacts variable. And this is the field that you see here in the class in the component. So this contacts field will then contain a query set that contains the newly added user. And that query set is what we are looping over here in the contact list, and that's why the new user is then displayed on the right hand side. So that's an important step. We're able now to add contacts to the list. If we go back to the page, what we now want to do is we want to take care of actually removing a contact from this list. Once we add a user, we don't want them to appear in this list. We want the user list to refresh, and that's why we have this users variable within the contact component. We're currently setting that by default equal to all users in the database except the logged in user. We want to now exclude anyone who's in the contact list as well. So what I'm going to do here is write another method in the Django-Unicorn component, and it's called getNonContacts. And the purpose of this method is to get any user in the database that's not already in the contact list. Now to do this, we can start by getting the primary keys of all users who are in the contacts, and we can reference self.contacts in order to do that. And for each contact, we're going to use the values list function and get the primary key for each of those contacts, each of the users essentially. And then what we're going to return from this function, first of all, let's copy this statement here that excludes the logged in user. We're going to return that statement, but we're also going to chain another exclude onto that. And what we want to exclude here is any user whose primary key is in this list of contact primary keys that we got above for the contacts. So to do that, we're going to look at the primary key, and we're going to use the in lookup, and we're going to search for any primary key that's in that list of contact primary keys. So we're excluding not just the logged in user, but also any existing contacts. So we now need to copy the name of this function and refer to it in the two methods above. Firstly, let's do it in the init method. So for self.users, we're going to set that equal to self.getNonContacts. And we can copy that down to the add contact function here. After we add the contact to the contact list, we can then call the getNonContacts function. Let's save that and go back to our page, and we can see how this looks. Now we have the user Shannon Whitney in the contact list. If we look at the drop down, we can see that that user is now no longer in the list, and we can see that this works if we add a new user, for example Susan Ellis. When we add that user, it's added to the contact list on the right hand side, but that user is no longer present in the drop down. Now at this point, I want to also add an option for users to remove a given user from their contact list. So I'm going to go to hero icons, and I'm going to search for a remove icon here. For example, this one on the right hand side. You can copy that as an SVG element and reference that in your HTML. So what we're going to do is go back to our Django-Unicorn component template, which is contactpage.html, and it's here that we're rendering out each contact in the contact list. What I'm actually going to do within the for loop is replace this with some new code, and let me tab that over a little bit. So we define a div with a class of flex and item center, and then we have, as we did before, the contact's username and a list tag, and below that we have an SVG element that contains this cross, this delete icon. Let's now go back to the template and refresh the page. I'm going to see how that looks. You can see that delete icon just to the right of each user in the contact list. Now when we click this icon, we want to remove the user from the contact list. Now we can achieve this in our template by adding a directive to the SVG tag. So let's add the unicorn statement, and the action we're going to listen for here is the click event. And when the click event occurs, we're going to call a function on our component again, and it's called delete contact, and we can actually pass dynamically the primary key of the contact that we are iterating over. So this is something new. We're passing an argument to the function that we're calling on the unicorn component, and we're referencing dynamically the contact primary key, and this contact comes from the for loop statement that we have in our Django template, where we're iterating over each contact in the list of contacts and then passing the contact's primary key as a parameter to the back end whenever this SVG is clicked. So that's the template code. Let's now go back to our component, and just below add contact, I'm going to define a new function here called delete contact, and that actually takes the argument of the primary key of the user you want to remove from your contact list. And we're going to see another method available on a many-to-many field here. We've already seen how to get all of our related fields objects, as well as how to actually add a new object to a related field. What I'm going to do is copy this statement here, and I'm going to bring this down into the delete contact function. And let's paste that in here, and instead of self.contact primary key, I want to actually reference the primary key that's passed in as a parameter here. And the function that we're calling, we don't want to call the add function, we actually want to call another function on this many-to-many field, and that's the remove function, and that will remove the relation between the two objects. Once we've done that and we've removed the contact, what we want to do is actually update self.contacts and also self.user. So I'm going to copy that code and we're going to bring that into this function here. So let's save this file and we can go back to our page here and refresh this page. When we click the cross button next to Susan Ellis here, you can see that that user is then removed from the contact list. And as well as that, we're updating self.users in the template, and that controls what's shown in this dropdown. And you can see that Susan Ellis reappears in the dropdown, and we can add her back to the contact list along with any other users we want, and we can then remove any particular user as we require. So we now have a dynamic contact list. We're allowed to add users to our list, and then we can also delete those users, as you can see here. And that updates the page dynamically. We don't need to do any refreshing of this page, and all of the code works natively in the Django ecosystem, and that's one big benefit of using Django-Unicorn in your applications. If you enjoy coding in Django using Django templates and Django and Python code, this will work very well for you. It's an alternative to using something like html or 𝗬𝗵𝗽. Now there's a couple of things I want to highlight before we finish this video. If we go back to our component, you can see that these two lines are repeated in 3 different places in our code. Firstly in the init method, also in the add contact and in the delete contact methods. So what I'm going to do is copy these 2 lines of code and I'm going to factor them out into a function called refresh the state. So let's define that function here, and I'm just going to call it refresh state. It's going to take self as an argument, and we can paste in those 2 lines of code. And that function is just responsible for fetching all of the contacts and also fetching all of the users who are not in the user's contact list. Once we've defined that, I'm going to replace the code in these 3 functions with that new function. So that's that done now, and that cuts down some of the lines of code, and it factors out the logic of refreshing the state into one place in the component. Now I'm going to finish this video with a small optimization here. What I'm going to do is add Django debug toolbar to this application. If you're interested in how that works, look at a previous video I did, which should be on the screen just now, showing how to set that up. I'm going to set that up now, and we'll get back to the video after it's set up. So I've set up Django debug toolbar, and you can see that on the right hand side. Now you can also see that when you load this page, 64 SQL queries are being executed here, and you can have a look at what these are if you're interested, but that is a lot of querying to be done when a page is loaded. And if we remove one of these users from the contact list, you can see that when that happens, we have now 128 queries, an awful lot of querying going on here. Now we can solve this very simply by looking at this page here called Advanced Views in the Django-Unicorn documentation. I'll link this below the video. And what you can do in your component is you can add a meta class very similar to Django models and forms, and you can add an attribute called JavaScript exclude, and there's also another one called exclude here, and you can exclude certain attributes or fields within your component from being added or exposed to JavaScript. So as it says here, to allow an attribute to be included in the context to be used by a Django template but not exposed to JavaScript, you can add it to the meta classes JavaScript exclude tuple, and this will have the benefit of whenever anything changes in your component, you don't need to re-serialize everything to JavaScript and perform all of these database queries. So what I'm going to do is copy this meta class here, and we're going to go back to the component template within contact_page.py, and right at the bottom here let's define a meta class, and we're going to change the fields that are excluded to the two fields here that contain our query sets, and that's contacts and users. So let's replace this with contacts, and we'll also add users into that. We can keep the reference to the contact primary key. That's simply a number, it's not going to do any sort of database fetching. Now we can keep the reference to the contact primary key in the template, but if we go back to our Django page here and refresh this page, you can see when it's first loaded we are only executing 4 queries in SQL, much faster and much more performant. And if we remove a user from the database, we see that we are performing 10 queries here, and it's possible you could get that down even further. I've not tried to do that, but feel free to try. And when we add a user, for example 𝗖𝗵𝗽, you can see that we are performing 11 queries, and this is much better than performing 128 queries whenever you want to remove a user from a contact list. That's not going to scale well in an application. So just to be aware that when you're using Django-Unicorn, just be careful about the number of SQL queries that you're executing and the code that you're writing. You may need to optimize in certain circumstances what's being exposed to JavaScript, and also the statements and data structures that you're using in the Unicorn component. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.